That should be
Most of the
interesting.
mysteries on this list involve things that have disappeared. Lost cities, vanished cultures, structures with no surviving builders. This next one is different. It involves a population that is still here, still speaking their ancient language, still living in roughly the same region they have occupied for thousands of years. The more closely geneticists have studied them, the more unusual their story has turned out to be. The Basques live in a region straddling the western end of the Pyrenees Mountains, on the border between what is now northern Spain and southwestern France. They call their homeland Euskal Herria. There are currently around 3 million Basque
I know
people.
what's going
The
on.
majority
because
live
it's
on the
encrypted.
Spanish side of the border. They have their own distinct cultural traditions, their own cuisine, their own sports, and most significantly for our purposes, their own language. Basque, known as Euskara, is a language isolated. That means it has no known relationship to any other language in the world, living or dead. It is not related to Spanish, French, or any other Romance language. It is not related to any Germanic or Slavic language. It is not Indo-European at all. It has no connection to any Semitic language family. Linguists have compared it to virtually every known language group and found nothing that constitutes a genuine family relationship. Euskara stands completely alone in the linguistic record and has done so for as long as it has been studied. For a long time, the language isolate status of Basque was treated as an interesting curiosity, something to be noted and then set aside. The genetic research of the past decade has made it considerably more interesting now. To understand what the genetics reveal, it helps to know something about what happened to the population of Europe over the past 10,000 years. After the last ice age ended, Europe was inhabited by hunter-gatherer populations, descended from people who had survived the glacial maximum in southern Refugia. Starting around 9,000 years ago, farmers from Anatolia, in what is now Turkey, began moving into Europe, bringing with them agriculture, domestic animals, and a different genetic profile from the existing inhabitants. These incoming farmers largely replaced or mixed with the hunter-gatherers across much of the continent over several thousand years. Then, around 5,000 to 4,000 years ago, another major shift happened. Groups associated with the Yamnaya culture of the Pontic steppe, the grasslands north of the Black Sea, in what is now Ukraine and Russia, expanded rapidly across Europe. They brought horses, wheeled vehicles, a pastoral economy, and, crucially, the ancestor languages of the Indo-European family, that today includes most of the languages spoken across Europe, from English and German to Greek and Russian. The genetic impact of this expansion was dramatic. Modern European populations carry DNA from all three of these groups: the original hunter-gatherers, the Neolithic farmers from Anatolia, and the Bronze Age steppe migrants, in varying proportions depending on where in Europe you look. The Basques carry substantially less steppe-related ancestry than almost any other European population. A landmark study published in Science in 2015 by Wolfgang Haug and colleagues, which analyzed ancient DNA from prehistoric Europeans across a wide geographic range, found that the Basques were the closest living descendants of the Neolithic farming populations that had arrived in Western Europe from Anatolia thousands of years earlier. Subsequent work by Johannes Krause's group at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology refined this picture further, showing that the pre-Indo-European population of the Iberian Peninsula more broadly had been genetically similar to the Basques, suggesting the Basques are not an isolated oddity, but a continuation of something that was once much more widespread. What this means for the language is significant. Euskara is not related to any Indo-European language, because the Basques are largely descended from people who were in Western Europe before the Bronze Age migrations that brought Indo-European languages to the continent. While those migrations reshaped the genetics and languages of virtually everyone else in Europe, the Basque region was either not reached by them or reached only minimally. The language the Basques speak today may represent the last surviving member of a family of languages that once extended across a much larger part of Western Europe, spoken by the Neolithic farming populations before the Bronze Age transformation. Why the Basque region was largely bypassed by migrations that swept across the rest of the continent, is the part that has not been satisfactorily explained. The Pyrenean Mountains form a natural barrier between the Iberian Peninsula and the rest of Europe, and it has been suggested that the specific geography of the Western Pyrenees provided enough of an obstacle to slow or redirect the movement of steppe-associated populations. But this explanation has a problem. Other mountain populations elsewhere in Europe, including in regions with terrain that is comparably challenging to cross, carry much higher levels of steppe ancestry than the Basques. Geography alone does not account for what happened. It is also worth noting that the Basques were not completely untouched by Bronze Age change. They do carry some steppe-related ancestry, which means contact occurred. What is unusual is the degree to which they maintained a predominantly pre-Bronze Age genetic profile relative to their neighbors. Whether this reflects a particularly strong resistance to outside influence, a specific geographic or social barrier that slowed integration more effectively here than elsewhere, or simply the particular way population movements played out in this corner of Europe, is still being worked out. The broader picture that emerges from the genetic research is one of a continent whose population history was considerably more turbulent and complex than anyone understood before ancient DNA analysis became possible. The idea of European populations as having been settled in their current locations for a very long time does not hold up. Most modern Europeans are the product of several major population units layered on top of each other across thousands of years. The Basques are unusual not because they are ancient in some absolute sense, but because they carry a higher proportion of an earlier layer than the populations around them, and because their language, which normally would have been replaced along with the genetic shift, somehow survived. What Euskara actually preserves from the pre-Indo-European world, what words and grammatical structures might reflect how those early Neolithic farmers of Western Europe thought about and described the world, is a question that historical linguists continue to work on. With no related languages to compare it to, the tools normally used to reconstruct language history cannot be applied. Euskara has to be approached on its own terms, and what it can tell us about the linguistic world that existed in Western Europe before the Bronze Age remains only partially understood. On the Golan Heights Plateau in the Middle East, sitting in a region that has been studied by archaeologists, historians, and biblical scholars for well over a century, there is a massive stone monument that most people have never heard of. It has two names. In Arabic, it is called Rujm el-Hiri, the Wheel of Ghosts. In Hebrew, it is Gilgal Rephaim, the Wheel of the Giants, the Rephaim being a legendary race of giants mentioned in the Hebrew Bible. Both names were given by people who found the structure already ancient and had no idea who had built it. The monument sits on a flat basalt plateau near the Sea of Galilee, in the area now under Israeli administration. It consists of 4 concentric stone rings arranged around a large central cairn, the whole structure covering an area of approximately 160 meters across. The stone used to build it, basalt gathered from the surrounding volcanic plateau, has been estimated at somewhere between 40,000 and 60,000 tons in total. The outer ring, the largest of the 4, still stands up to 2.5 meters high and 2.5 meters wide in places. The rings are not perfectly uniform, but they are clearly deliberate, clearly planned, and clearly the product of a significant and sustained effort. The central cairn is approximately 15 meters across and 5 meters high. Excavation of this central feature has produced human remains and burial goods that date to the Middle Bronze Age, roughly 2000 to 1500 BC. The cairn appears to have functioned as a burial monument, and the human remains confirm that at some point it was used for that purpose. What is less clear is whether the burial function came first and the rings were built around it, or whether the rings came first and the central cairn was added later as a secondary use of an already existing one. The broader construction of the rings is believed to date to the Chalcolithic period or the early Bronze Age, roughly 4,500 to 2000 BC, based on the pottery and material found at the site. That replaced the original construction anywhere from 5,000 to 6,000 years later, making Rujm el-Hiri older than Stonehenge, older than the Pyramid precise enough to pin down the exact period, and the wide range of the estimate reflects how difficult the site has been to date with confidence. The Golan Plateau is not short of ancient monuments. From dolmens, the megalithic burial chambers built from 2 or more upright stones topped with a large capstone are found across the plateau in large numbers, representing a regional tradition of stone monument building that goes back thousands of years. Runa El-Hiri fits within that broader tradition, but takes it to a completely different scale. Building a single dolmen requires moving and placing a handful of large stones. Building Runa El-Hiri required moving tens of thousands of tons of basalt into 4 concentric rings across a volcanic plateau, which implies a level of social organization and coordinated labor that goes well beyond what was needed with the single chamber tubes found nearby. Who organized that effort is unknown. The early Bronze Age societies of the southern Levant were becoming increasingly complex during this period, developing agriculture, trade networks, and the beginnings of urban settlement. But they are not well enough documented archaeologically to confidently assign specific leadership structures to a project of this scale. The monument is there, the stones are there, the identity of whoever decided to build it and directed the work remains completely unknown. The site was spotted from the air, and first formally documented by researchers in the 1960s and 70s. Since then, it has been the subject of surface survey, aerial photography, and limited excavation, primarily focused on the central cairn. What lies beneath the ring walls themselves, and in the spaces between the rings, has never been systematically investigated. The monument has not been fully excavated.
Really?
Given its scale, a thorough excavation would be a major undertaking, and the ongoing political complexity of the Golan Heights has not made large-scale archaeological projects straightforward to organize. The most discussed open question about the rings, beyond who built them, is what they were actually for. The burial function of the central cairn provides one answer for one element of the site, but it does not explain the rings. Several researchers have proposed that the openings built into the rings were deliberately aligned with astronomical events, specifically the summer solstice sunrise and the winter solstice sunrise. A study by Jonathan Mizrahi and colleagues, published in the Journal of Biblical Archaeologist, examined the alignment question in detail and found evidence supporting the idea that the openings were intentionally oriented towards solstice positions. If that is correct, it would place Runa El-Hiri alongside Stonehenge, Newgrange, and the Goseck Circle in Germany as part of a broader ancient tradition of building monuments that mark the movement of the sun across the year. The astronomical alignment interpretation has not been universally accepted. Other researchers have questioned whether the evidence is strong enough to confirm intentional alignment rather than coincidental orientation, and the debate has continued without resolution. Part of the difficulty is that without a complete excavation of the site, the full picture of how the monument is laid out and how its various elements relate to each other is not available. The 2 names given to the site by people who found it unexplained are worth noting. Wheel of Ghosts and Wheel of Giants both reflect the same response. A structure so large and so old that the people who encountered it could not account for it through normal historical memory, and attributed it instead to supernatural or legendary beings. The same pattern appears at the Gantija temples in Malta, at Stonehenge itself, and at megalithic sites across the world. When a monument outlasts the cultural memory of the people who built it, the explanations that fill the gap tend to involve giants, gods, or ghosts. At Runa El-Hiri, after decades of modern archaeological study, the gap in knowledge is smaller than it was, but the central questions remain open. In 1948, a British diplomat named Sir Alec Kirkbride was flying over the desert of central Jordan when he looked down and saw something that made no immediate sense. Running across the landscape below him, stretching north to south through the open desert, was a wall. Not a short boundary marker or a ruined building, but a long, deliberate, linear structure that went on further than he could track from the air. He noted it, reported it, and the question of what it was has never been properly answered. The wall is called the Khat Shabib, It runs for approximately 150 kilometers across the Jordanian desert, built from loose stones stacked into a low barrier, roughly 1 meter high and 1 meter wide. Some sections are more carefully built than others, with stones more deliberately placed and the line more clearly defined. Other sections are rougher, lower, and harder to distinguish from the natural scatter of rock across the desert floor. It is not a continuous line either. It breaks into long stretches with gaps between, which might mean deliberate openings were built into the design, or simply that parts of it have collapsed or been taken apart over the centuries by people using the stones for other purposes. What remains is one of the most puzzling structures in the region. The landscape it crosses gives some sense of the scale of the undertaking. Central Jordan is a mix of basalt fields, limestone plateau, and open desert. A landscape that is harsh, exposed, and not easy to move through. Building a wall across it, even a low one, required sourcing and placing stones consistently across a distance that would take days to walk. The wall does not follow a straight line either. It curves and shifts with the terrain, suggesting the people who built it were responding to the landscape as they went, rather than working from a fixed plan laid out in advance. That in itself points to a significant and organized effort, rather than something put together informally. The name Khat Shabib comes from a figure in Arab legend named Shabib ibn Yazid, who some medieval Islamic texts credit with building a great wall across the desert. Whether that legend has anything to do with the actual wall has never been shown. It is more likely that later people, finding a wall they could not explain, simply attached a familiar name to it. That happens a lot with ancient structures, and it does not get us any closer to an answer. The name has stuck regardless, and it is what researchers and locals use to refer to it today. The wall crosses a part of Jordan that has a very well-recorded history. The Nabateans, the people who carved Petra from the red cliffs of southern Jordan, controlled this region from around the 4th century BC and built roads, water channels, and agricultural systems across it. The Romans took over in 106 AD, establishing the province of Arabia Petraea and continuing to develop the infrastructure of the region. The Byzantines followed, and then came the early Islamic world. Every one of these cultures left traces in the landscape around the wall. Not one of them left a record of building it. Attempts to date the wall have been made using pottery and other small finds from the surrounding area, but the results have not been helpful. The best estimate puts construction somewhere between 200 BC and 600 AD, a window of nearly 8 centuries that covers several completely different empires and cultures. That is such a wide range that it tells us almost nothing useful about who is actually responsible. The pottery found near the wall does not narrow things down because the region was continuously occupied across the whole period, and material from multiple eras shows up across the landscape, regardless of the wall's construction date. The most thorough modern study was done by David Kennedy and a team from the University of Western Australia, working from aerial photography and satellite imagery alongside ground survey. Their survey found sections of the wall that had not been recorded before, which means the wall may actually be longer than the 150-kilometer figure that has been the standard estimate for decades. Kennedy's team mapped the route of the wall in more detail than any previous study, and noted that it consistently sits in a zone separating farming land to the west from open grazing territory to the east, which shaped their thinking about what it might have been. Their best guess was that the Khat Shabib served as an agricultural boundary, a physical line keeping grazing animals out of cultivated fields. In the ancient Near East, tension between settled farmers and nomadic pastoralists was a recurring feature of life, and physical barriers between farming and grazing are documented in other parts of the region. The idea fits the geography and the land use pattern around the wall reasonably. Kennedy's team were also clear that the evidence does not confirm it, and that the real answer is still unknown. Other researchers have suggested different explanations. Some think it was a territorial marker between two political groups, a line on the ground establishing where one jurisdiction ended and another began. Others have compared it to desert kites, the large stone funnel structures found across the region that were used to channel animals Under that reading, the wall might have been part of the system for directing animal movement across the desert rather than simply blocking it. A fourth idea is that it marked the edge of a road or track. That explanation has the least support, but has not been entirely ruled out. The problem with all of these theories is the same. None of them can be confirmed from what the site currently offers. The wall has not been excavated in any serious or systematic way. Ground survey of the full length remains incomplete because the terrain is difficult and the sheer length of the structure makes a comprehensive field investigation a major undertaking. There are long sections of the wall that researchers have never physically walked. What a proper investigation across the full 150 kilometers might find has never been established because that work has not been done. What stands out most about the caution is not just the missing explanation, but the missing record. The Nabateans kept records of what they built. The Romans kept detailed records of infrastructure projects across their provinces. The Byzantines kept records. The early Islamic administration kept records. Building a wall 150 kilometers long across an open desert would have taken significant time, labor, and organization under any of these governments, and any of them would normally have left some trace. There is nothing, no inscription on the wall itself, no administrative document, no mention in any surviving text from any period that can be confidently tied to the structure sitting out in the Jordanian desert. And for a region as historically well documented as this one, a 150-kilometer wall with no name, no builder, and no paper trail is a genuinely strange thing to encounter. We are heading back to Peru for this next one, specifically to the southern coast, to a desert peninsula where a Peruvian archaeologist made a discovery in 1928 that has been generating debate ever since, and where the central question raised by that discovery has still not been fully resolved. Paracas culture occupied the southern coast of Peru from roughly 800 to 100 BC. They are best known for two things: their textiles, which are considered among the finest ever produced in Asia, with thread counts and dye work that still impress textile specialists today, and their burials, which is where the story begins. In 1928, Julio Tello, one of the founding figures of Peruvian archaeology, excavated a cemetery site in Cerro Colorado on the Paracas Peninsula. What he found there were hundreds of mummy bundles, each one a tightly wrapped individual surrounded by grave goods, including ceramics, food, weapons, and examples of those extraordinary textiles. The dry desert conditions of the peninsula had preserved the bundles remarkably well, and when they were opened, the physical remains inside were in good condition with material that was over 2,000 years old. Among the individuals uncovered, a significant number had elongated skulls, not slightly elongated, but dramatically so, with the back of the skull extending far further upward and backward than normal human skull proportions would allow. The degree of elongation in the most extreme examples was striking enough that photographs of the skulls, they began circulating widely in the 21st century, attracted immediate attention of people with no background in archaeology who could see with their own eyes that something unusual was going on. Before getting into what makes these skulls genuinely puzzling, it is worth establishing the mainstream explanation, because it is well supported and applies to the large majority of what is found. Intentional cranial modification through head binding is a documented practice across numerous ancient cultures worldwide. In the ancient Andes, it was particularly widespread, with different bindings.
Are there any muscles right above my collarbone that I could pull? I was moving an air conditioner that was ridiculously heavy because it was AC, heat, and dehumidifier. I ended up falling over sideways, and now the collarbone area of my chest hurts. I am not concerned about it because I will feel 100% normal tomorrow, as that is how I heal. However, I'm just curious what I did because I rarely ever experience actual pain. To be completely honest, it's kind of to be completely honest, it's actually refreshing because I feel my nerves all the time. I feel of the time, but I don't ever feel actual pain. This is the first time I have felt legitimate pain in at least a year. Don't get me wrong, I feel pain, which is, I guess my tolerance is so high that anything but crawling out of my skin, razor blade skin suit, or like I'm being skewered, burned, stabbed, frozen, sliced up, etc. Doesn't really matter. Doesn't really register to me. Hurts when I put my chin down. Clavicle, clavicular insertion stress, clavicular insertion stress, clavicular insertion stress. That sounds about right because it's a really tight spot right over my clavicle. When I put my chin down, it pulls onto it. Why not? And otherwise, it's kind of a burning pain. I may have bruised it because it's really tender where I touched, and I just realized that there's an actual gash there. But nonetheless, thank you for. I think I bruised it somehow because there's an actual abrasion and cut there. I think I bruised it somehow because there's an actual abrasion and cut there. But nonetheless, I'm good. It feels good to have pain. I don't know if that's a bad thing or what, but I have to say I'm enjoying this pain. I'm so used to my nerves hurting that this is overwhelming them to some degree, and it feels wonderful. I don't think normal people experience pain like this. But my world is inverted. That's why I'm trying. Apparent, apparently, my sensation of pain is also inverted compared to everyone else. Just just like the rest of the world is currently inverted into their nonsense, I'm inverted in regards to my pain. Thank you for clarifying. Oh yeah, forgot to put that on there. Very nice. My yeah, I forgot I was in the live stream. Yeah.
Is used by different cultural groups, apparently as markers of social and political identity. The practice involves wrapping an infant's head tightly during the period when the cranial bones are still malleable, typically the first few years of life, and maintaining that binding long enough to permanently reshape the skull as it grows. The result is an elongated form that is retained for the rest of the individual's life. This explanation accounts for elongated skulls across Peru and Bolivia, including many of the Paracas examples, and it is the position of mainstream archaeology. The Paracas culture's use of cranial modification fits within a broader Andean tradition that is well documented at multiple sites across the region. Where it gets more complicated is with a specific subset of the most extreme Paracas specimens, and with two particular features that some researchers have argued the binding explanation does not fully account for. The first is the parietal plate. A normal human skull has two parietal bones, one on each side of the top of the skull, meeting at the center in a joint called the sagittal suture. Several of the most extreme Paracas skulls appear to have a single parietal plate rather than two separate bones joined by a suture. This is not something that head binding produces. Binding reshapes the skull by redirecting growth, but it does not cause two bones to fuse into
Oh yeah,
or prevent the sagittal suture from
parietal
forming.
suture.
If
Yeah,
the single
that's not
parietal
the same
plate
thing.
observation is accurate and consistent across multiple specimens, it represents a genuine anatomical difference rather than a deformation effect. The second is cranial bone. Head binding reshapes the skull, but does not increase its internal capacity. The total volume of the skull stays roughly the same,
That's like a
whether the shape is round or elongated.
wow.
Some of the Paracas skulls have been reported with
That's-
cranial volume
wow.
significantly above the normal range, with some figures cited at 60% or more above average. If those measurements
Damn,
are accurate, they
it's
are not
huge.
explained by binding. Both of these points have become central to the ongoing debate, and both of them come with a significant problem. The detailed, independent, peer-reviewed measurement and
Several
analysis of the most extreme specimens under controlled scientific conditions with published results has not been comprehensively carried out. The observations about parietal plates and cranial volumes have come primarily from researchers working outside the mainstream academic structure,
Oh.
and the data has not been subjected to the level of scrutiny that would be needed to confirm or rule out the claims with confidence. The DNA question adds another layer. Around 2014, a project led by researcher Brian Forster, working with geneticist Lloyd Pye, publicized results from DNA analysis of Paracas skull samples.
Okay.
The reported findings suggested mitochondrial DNA haplogroups that did not match known Andean populations or any other known human group. These results attracted enormous online attention. They were never published in a peer-reviewed journal, and the methodology behind them was questioned by geneticists who reviewed what was publicly available analysis. A peer-reviewed study of ancient DNA from Paracas individuals, published in the journal PLOS One by Farron Schmitz and colleagues, examined genetic material from the region and found results entirely consistent with known South American populations. The study found no evidence of unusual or anomalous genetic material in the samples analyzed. The tension between these two bodies of evidence, one peer-reviewed and finding nothing unusual, one not peer-reviewed and claiming something significant, is where the debate currently sits. The mainstream archaeological position is clear and backed by published science. The alternative claims about parietal plates and cranial volumes remain unresolved, not because they have been tested and found wrong, but because they have not been tested to the standard required to either confirm or dismiss them. The Paracas
That's kinda
skulls
cool.
are held primarily
Mm.
at the Paracas History Museum in the town of Paracas and at other Peruvian institutions. Access for independent researchers has been limited at various points, which has added to the frustration of those who argue that a thorough, independent analysis of the most extreme specimens would settle the debate one way or the other. Whether that analysis will be carried out under conditions that produce publishable peer-reviewed results remains an open question. What is not in dispute is that the Paracas Peninsula Cemetery produced an extraordinary set of human remains that some of those remains show unusual physical characteristics, and that the full picture of what the Paracas culture was and where it fits in the broader story of South American prehistory is still being worked out. Ancient DNA research across South America has consistently produced surprises about population history in the region, and the Paracas culture's place within that history has not been definitively established.
I want to see if I can clean it up.
In a library at Yale University, there is a book that has been sitting unread for 600 years. Not unread because nobody has tried, unread because nobody has been able to. The Voynich manuscript is a handwritten, illustrated book of approximately 240 pages, written entirely in an unknown script and filled with colored drawings that have never been satisfactorily explained. It is cataloged in Yale's Botanical Rare Book and Manuscript Library as MS408, and it has attracted more sustained academic and cryptographic attention than almost any other documented. Teams from Bletchley Park, the Second World War code-breaking center that cracked the Nazi Enigma cipher, looked at it. The United States National Security Agency looked at it. Linguists, manuscript scholars, statisticians, and historians have all taken their turns. None of them have produced a translation that the academic community has accepted. The manuscript came to wider attention in 1912 when Wilfred Voynich, a Polish book dealer with a reputation for tracking down rare manuscripts, purchased it from the Jesuit college of Villa Mondragone near Viscosity in Italy. Voynich immediately recognized it as unusual and began trying to have it decoded, which is how the long sequence of failed attempts began. Radiocarbon dating carried out by the University of Arizona in 2009 dated development. Paired animal skin the book is written on to between 1400 and 1440 AD. The book's physical materials are therefore confirmed as early 15th century, though the text could in theory have been written later on older material. The provenance before Voynich's purchase is partially known. A letter found with the manuscript, written in 1666, by Johannes Marcus Marci, Charles University in Prague, to the Jesuit scholar Athanasius Kircher in Rome, records that the book had previously been owned by the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolf II, who reigned from 1576 to 1612. Rudolf was known for his obsessive collection of unusual, rare, and occult objects, and according to the letter, he paid 600 ducats for the manuscript, which was an enormous sum. Before Rudolf's ownership, the trail goes cold. The content of the manuscript is divided into sections that researchers have given working labels based on what the illustrations appear to show. The botanical section contains drawings of plants, most of which do not clearly match any known species.
Yeah.
Some appear to combine features of different real plants in ways that could suggest imagination, symbolic representation, or a deliberate attempt to obscure the connection to real botanical knowledge. The astronomical section has circular diagrams with what appear to be star patterns and zodiac-like figures that do not straightforwardly match any known astronomical tradition. The biological section is the one that tends to attract the most attention, containing groups of nude female figures submerged in or moving through elaborate systems of pipes and pools, the meaning of which has never been established. The cosmological and pharmaceutical sections contain further diagrams and what appear to be.
Here is something interesting. I'm doing some crystalline sonography with a
the script itself
video from YouTube on about
it uses
ancient, uncharted,
depending on how certain
ancient
forms are
things,
arranged
and
what look like
it has been wonderfully interesting all day
with certain character combinations
for the past 45 minutes, except until it got to the Voynich manuscript.
Rather than random simple sequences. Statistical analysis
and my
has found that the
crystallization interference patterns are essentially bland.
Which suggests the script is encoding something with a real
There's no real information coming through. It's just kind of
what that structure
dull.
Has not been identified. No researcher has
If I had to put money on it, it's because that Voynich manuscript is a scam.
No proposed translation has produced readable content that other scholars have been able to verify.
Whomever wrote it back then was
no close parallels in any other.
Whomever wrote it back then did so
Theories about what the
for
manuscript
monetary
is, where it
purposes.
came
They sold it to
cover a
someone
very
to make
wide
money.
range.
It is
The
written
most
in
straightforward
a
possible
nonsensical
is that it
and
is a genuine text,
fake
natural
language
language,
or
written
something
in
that
a
doesn't
cipher, a coded
have
form that has not yet been
informational
cracked.
density to
Many
us.
historical manuscripts were written in cipher to protect medical,
At least none that I
alchemical,
can detect.
or other specialist knowledge from outside readers.
This is
And a
obviously
sophisticated
pure
cipher
speculation.
from the 15th century could in principle
Obviously
still
pure
resist
speculation
modern
on my
analysis.
part, but I have been watching these crystalline sonographies for crystalline sonifications. Sonifications. No. For months now, and I know the difference between different frequencies of informational density, and that manuscript is. Oh, come on, really? I am watching a documentary while doing crystalline sonography, and the interference patterns tell me all sorts of amazing things. I have seen rings, coils, every shape you can imagine, and it happens from the different frequencies that we input. So I'm watching a documentary on YouTube, and they got to the. And up until this specific segment has been wonderful. It's been producing rings, spoked wheels, all all sorts of different geometries. And then it gets to the Voynich manuscript. And it goes bland, generic, goes bland. It loses its structure, shape. It crystallizes, but without any informational interference pattern, essentially. I have only seen that a handful of times, and that happens when there is no informational density tied to something. And I believe that Voynich manuscript is a scam because someone wrote it for monetary purposes. It was written by the manuscript has no informational density, meaning that it's simply the shape of the waveform, meaning that, well, I don't think it's real. I'm pretty sure it was something sold to someone back in the day. Then to make a lot of money, but it has no actual point. There are two explanations. One is that it is a forgery, is that it is, first off, I must say it's legitimate. It is real, of course. It was made back then, it was made by a real human being. There was a lot of time put into it. I'm not discounting any of that. What I'm saying is that its purpose, its point of existence, was either for making money or it has something far beyond our human understanding, because everything that I've encountered has informational density. Because almost everything I've encountered, everything has some sort of informational density, and I have seen a few cases where when I have had frequencies on that were false, deceitful, or had alternative purposes, things of that nature, those produced lackluster sonifications. As I said, this is all speculative. However, either that manuscript was written by someone that is not of standard quantum, is not quantum, or it's something else. And personally, that has no access to quantum information. You're going to have to trust me on this because I've been doing this, well, I get information from everything, and this is the one document in all of my time transducing, doing quantum transductions, crystalline sonography, and all the other unique things that I've been exposed to that has no informational density to it. It is simply the shape, meaning that it is a false front. It was a meme. It is a. It was created to have a purpose that was other than sharing information. Spreading or create or building information. God fucking fucking God. Touche, salesman. I take your point, and until we have further discovery on the manuscript, I'm going to have to step back from it because I get where you're coming from, and you're not giving me a binary response. So it's either something extraordinarily amazing or something a big fake was used to manipulate someone. Nonetheless, we will leave it at this. Thank you for your feedback. God, fucking disgusting. just so I can back up. If I were to put on some a shear or song that has no purpose, that is just
Scooter, you have to go upstairs because I know there's eating. Gross. Oh, fucking gross. Oh.
In a natural language, written in an enciphered, encoded form that has not yet been cracked. Many historical manuscripts.
I may have to agree with you actually, because as I had the show paused for a while, and I just unpaused it, and it picked up exactly where you were going off on speaking from. So, and when that happens, that is typically the waveform pointing the direction of where I should be looking. So it would appear it is encrypted and no one's figured it out yet. And the encryption is so good that it's hiding its informational density. The same way that I have my cloak of near invisibility or parallax view. Oh my god, Scooter, fuck.
Protect medical, chemical, or other specialist knowledge from outside readers, and a sophisticated cipher from the 15th century could in principle still resist modern analysis. The second possibility is that the script is an artificial language invented by its author, of which several examples were produced in the early modern periods. The third possibility
It's in crystalline mode, that's awesome. Oh, sweet. Okay,
is that the whole thing is a hoax produced to deceive wealthy collectors like me, who would pay large sums for unusual and apparent arcane documents. Under this reading, the script would be meaningless, constructed to look like a real language without actually encoding it. In 2019, a paper published in the journal Romance Studies by Gerard Cheshire claimed that the manuscript had been deciphered as a form of proto-Romance language, a medieval dialect that predated modern Romance languages like Spanish, French, and Italian. The claim attracted significant media coverage. It also attracted immediate and widespread criticism. Linguists and manuscript scholars pointed to fundamental problems with the methodology and the proposed readings. The journal subsequently retracted the paper following a review process. It was not the first claimed decipherment of the Voynich manuscript, and it was not the first retraction. The Botanical Library digitized the manuscript and made high-resolution images of every page freely available online, which means the document is now more accessible to researchers than at any point in its history. The open availability has brought in new attempts from outside traditional academic disciplines, including computational linguists and machine learning researchers who have applied modern analytical tools to the text. These efforts have produced interesting observations about the statistical properties of the script, but have not produced a reading. 600 years after it was made, the Voynich manuscript remains exactly what it was when Wilfrid Voynich pulled it out of a collection in Italy in 1912. A book full of text and illustrations, carefully made, clearly significant to whoever produced it, and still completely unreadable to everyone who was tried since.
Alright, now we'll get some informational density, hopefully. Yeah, there we go.
From an unreadable manuscript in the Yale Library, we move to the jungles and hills of southwestern India, where thousands of ancient stone structures are sitting in the landscape, largely unstudied and in many cases
Ooh,
unrecorded.
we're getting
The Kerala
parallel
dolmens are
vertical
not a single
bands. That's
famous
what we
site or a
want.
single famous
Stay
district.
vertical.
They are a tradition spread
Honeycomb,
across a
alright,
large
that's good.
area of South India.
Honeycombs.
And the question they raise
As long
is
as there's
one
a
that
dot.
researchers have been aware of since the 19th century without arriving at a satisfying answer. Kerala, the southwestern state of India,
Ooh,
bordered
that's
by the
interesting.
Arabian Sea to the west and the Western Ghats Mountains to the east, contains an estimated 2,000 or more dolmens. That estimate is uncertain because a comprehensive
Look
modern
at that
survey
structure.
has never been completed.
Wow.
New sites continue to be reported by local researchers working in areas that formal archaeology has not yet covered, so the actual total may be higher. Neighboring states, Tamil Nadu and Karnataka, contain thousands more, along with related megalithic structures, including stone circles, standing stones called menhirs, and large burial mounds. Taken together, South India has one of the largest concentrations of megalithic burial monuments anywhere in the world. A dolmen, for those unfamiliar with the term, is a simple but substantial structure. Two or more large upright stones are placed in the ground to form the walls of a small chamber, and a single large flat stone is laid across the top as a capstone. The result is a covered space used as a burial chamber. They are found in Europe, in Korea, in parts of the Middle East, and across South and Southeast Asia. The Kerala versions follow exactly the same basic design as the ones in France, Ireland, Spain, and Britain, built thousands of kilometers away, and, based on current data, by people with no documented connection to each other. The Kerala dolmens date primarily to the Iron Age in South Asia, roughly 1000 to 300 BC, though some may be earlier. They were first formally documented by British colonial-era archaeologists in the 19th century, with more systematic survey work carried out by scholars, including Frederick Price, in the early 20th century. What those early researchers noticed, and what has been noted by every researcher who has worked on the subject since, is how closely the South Indian dolmens resemble their European counterparts in basic form. The material culture associated with the South Indian megalithic builders includes distinctive black and red ware pottery, iron objects, and evidence of elaborate burial practices involving multiple individuals placed in the same chamber over time, with significant grave goods accompanying. This
Look
burial
at that.
tradition
That's
points to
from
communities
Korean
who place
dolmens.
considerable importance on how their dead were treated and commemorated.
Look at those amazing ring
Stone
structures.
structures that would mark the location of the buried individuals and presumably allow for ongoing ritual activity at the site. Who exactly built these structures is not established. The South Indian megalithic tradition predates the beginning of written records for this region, which means the builders left no direct account of themselves. Their relationship to the later historical populations of South India is inferred rather than proven. Some researchers have connected the megalithic builders to the Dravidian-speaking communities who have lived in South India for a very long time, pointing to cultural continuities across the long stretch of time between the megalithic period and the historical.
Yeah, it is awesome.
Continuity across time does not confirm direct descent, and the connection remains an inference based on circumstantial evidence, rather than a demonstrated fact. The comparison with European dolmens is where the most discussed and least resolved
Look at the
question
bubble
sits.
fighting it.
The structural similarity between South
That's
Indian
cool.
dolmens
That's
and
different.
those found in Europe has been
Whoa,
studied
that
since
was
researchers
crazy
began
cool. That
formally
was
studying it,
wow. And
but
there's
it has
an
never
epilogue.
been satisfactorily explained.
Snapped.
The two traditions are separated by thousands of kilometers and by a significant time gap. European megalithic construction peaked between roughly 4000 and 2000 BC. It was largely complete before the South Indian tradition reached its height. The people building dolmens in France or Ireland, and the people building them in Kerala, were not in direct contact with each other, as far as any evidence shows. Three explanations have been put forward for the similarity. The first is independent invention, the idea that both traditions arrived at the same architectural solution.
I just realized something. It could be the fact that it's the narrator's informational density reflecting on the Voynich manuscript
This
versus-
is the explanation favored by most mainstream archaeologists, and it is the simplest reading of the available evidence.
versus the
The second
actual
is
informational
cultural.
density of the
The
topic.
idea that knowledge of the dolmen spread from one region to another through trade and migration networks.
If he doesn't
Different
understand
parts
it and he thinks there's nothing to it,
along the
then there's going to be no density
The
in his
third is a
waveform.
shared origin. The idea that
I think
both
that may be
traditions
more
descend
akin
from
to
an
what the
earlier
explanation
common
is
practice
than
that has not yet been identified.
as I am trying to look at this from the point of view of waveform audio when this is not waveform audio, it is narration. So that means that there's going to be a different structure or
The degree of structural
transposition to it. If that's the case, then it would make sense because there is not enough information on that manuscript to say anything specific until someone actually figures something out. It's going to be looked at as a hoax or with extreme skeptic. The same way I did with extreme skepticism. And I think the narrator may have the same point of view I did for taking the same point of view I have.
barrier between the South Indian and European dolmen traditions is considerable, going beyond the basic form to include details of
I'm still
construction,
figuring all this out. We're
spatial
doing all of that
organization,
in some way or
microspectral
some shape.
theory of why
It's just a matter
two
of
traditions genuinely
figuring
developed in complete isolation.
step by
A
step.
study by Shinda and colleagues examining the broader South Asian megalithic tradition
I have
and the
figured out
distribution
a
and
majority
variety
of the shape.
monument types across the region, and
Yeah.
argued for regional development with contact between subregions.
We're doing exactly that in another
It did
thread.
not directly tackle the question of how the South Indian tradition
I am
relates
trying
what's
to
happening
break this
in
down
the
into
Earth.
specific
Practical
sections
problem
to figure out
is
what
that the
does what.
knowledge base for making
Yeah,
this
I'm
comparison
upset. I already got
is not
pressed.
complete on either side. In Europe, megalithic studies have been ongoing for well over a century, and the tradition is reasonably well documented. In Kerala and the surrounding states, the survey
If you're gonna smell
been
it, I'm
partially
gonna have to get out.
sites that
God.
are known to local communities for generations are only now being formally reported, and the full picture of the regional tradition, how many structures exist, what their range of forms is, and how they are distributed across the landscape, is not yet available. A comprehensive modern survey using current
Why didn't
methods,
it?
including aerial and
I'm
satellite
just gonna do
imagery,
that flush
to
again.
identify sites in forested and difficult terrain,
Yep.
has not been
It's so
carried out.
cool.
What South India has is an enormous and largely understudied megalithic tradition that raises a genuine question about prehistoric connectivity that archaeology has not yet answered, and a landscape that is almost certainly still giving up sites that formal research has not yet reached.
Wait, India. India.
We finished tonight in Central
Korea.
India, at a monument that most people interested in ancient history will have heard of, and far fewer will know in any real detail. The Great Stupa at Sanchi is one of the oldest stone structures in India, one of the best preserved examples of early Buddhist architecture, and a UNESCO World Heritage Site that has been studied seriously by researchers for well over a century. It also contains puzzles that those researchers have not fully solved, sitting in plain sight on a hilltop in the state of Madhya Pradesh. The stupa was originally commissioned by the Mauryan Emperor Ashoka around 250 BC. Ashoka is one of the most significant figures in the history of ancient India, a ruler who came to power through military conquest and then underwent a dramatic personal transformation after the Kalinga War, a conflict that resulted in enormous casualties, and that Ashoka's own inscriptions describe as having left him overwhelmed by the scale of the suffering. He converted to Buddhism, renounced further military expansion, and spent the rest of his reign promoting Buddhist principles across his empire, commissioning the construction of stupas to enshrine relics of the Buddha at sacred sites across the subcontinent. Sanchi was among the most important of these. The original Ashokan stupa was a solid hemispherical mound of brick built over a relic deposit surrounded by a wooden railing. During the Shunga period, in the 2nd and 1st centuries BC, the structure was significantly enlarged. The brick mound was encased in stone, the drum base was added, the surrounding railing was rebuilt in stone, and 4 elaborately carved stone gateways called toranas were constructed at the cardinal points around the monument. The Shunga dynasty was associated with the revival of Brahmanical religious tradition rather than Buddhism, which makes their continued investment in developing a Buddhist site like Sanchi an interesting historical detail. Sanchi appears to have held a significance that crossed the sectarian boundaries of the time. The toranas are what most visitors to Sanchi come to see. They are extraordinary objects. Each gateway consists of 2 square vertical posts and 3 curved horizontal beams stacked one above the other, and every surface of every element is covered in carved relief scenes. The density of the carving is remarkable. Figures, animals, architectural elements, trees, celestial beings, and narrative scenes are packed across every available face of each gateway, arranged in horizontal registers that run across the beams and up and down the posts. The total quantity of carved information across the 4 toranas is enormous, representing a major artistic and religious program produced in the 1st century BC. The problem, from a research perspective, is that the full logic of how those scenes are organized and what they are meant to communicate together has not been worked out. Individual scenes have been identified, matched to known stories from the Buddha's life and from the Jataka tales of his previous incarnations, and placed in their narrative context. But the overall program, the sequence in which the scenes are meant to be read, the relationships between scenes of different gateways, and the broader symbolic architecture of the composition as a whole has been debated by scholars for over a century without reaching consensus. Different researchers have proposed different reading sequences, different frameworks for understanding how the gateways were meant to work together as a unified religious statement. The debate is still active. One of the most distinctive features of the Sanchi carvings is what is absent from them. The Buddha himself never appears in human form anywhere in the carvings, despite being the central subject of the scenes. The toranas were made during a period before the tradition of depicting the Buddha as a human figure had developed.
Pretzels.
That tradition emerged later in the Gandhara region of what is now northwestern Pakistan and Afghanistan, where Greek artistic conventions, introduced by Alexander the Great's campaigns, blended with Buddhist iconography to produce the first anthropomorphic images of the Buddha. At Sanchi, his presence is shown through symbols: a wheel representing the first sermon, a throne indicating where he sat, a parasol marking his position as a great being, footprints, or a Bodhi tree beneath which he achieved enlightenment. The scenes that surround these symbolic markers, showing crowds of worshippers, historical events, celestial beings, and architectural spaces, have to be read with the understanding that the central figure they all relate to is never directly shown. How to correctly reconstruct the narrative meaning of the scenes, given this symbolic approach to the main subject, is part of what makes the Sanchi carving program so difficult to fully decode. A study by Julia Shaw, published in the journal World Archaeology, took a different approach to understanding the site by looking outward from the stupa rather than inward at the carvings. Shaw examined the relationship between Sanchi and the surrounding landscape, mapping smaller satellite markets, settlements, water management features, and agricultural systems in a wider region. Her analysis argued that Sanchi should be understood as the center of a much larger sacred and economic landscape, rather than as the isolated monument. This landscape approach changed how researchers think about the site's function and significance, suggesting it played a role in organizing and sustaining the surrounding communities in ways that went beyond purely religious commemoration. The engineering of the Great Stupa itself has also attracted attention. The hemispherical dome is geometrically precise in a way that required accurate planning and measurement to achieve. The drum base is level, and the dome rises from it in a consistent curve that has maintained its form for over 2,000 years. Producing this kind of geometric accuracy in the 3rd century BC, using the construction techniques and measuring tools available at the time, involved a level of knowledge about geometry and construction planning that the surviving record does not fully document. How Mauryan builders achieved this precision is not comprehensively understood. Recent ground-penetrating radar surveys of the Stupa Mound have attempted to image the interior of the structure without excavating it, looking for information about the original relic deposit placed by Ashoka and the internal organization of the mound. The surveys have produced data about the structure inside the dome, but have not resolved questions about the original contents of the relic chamber, or the full sequence of how the monument was built and modified over time. The interior of the great stupa at Sanchi has never been excavated, and what exactly Ashoka placed at its heart in the 3rd century BC remains unknown. For a monument this well studied, at a site this significant, with this much academic attention directed at it across more than a century of research, the list of things that remain genuinely unresolved is longer than most people would expect. Northern Peru's coast is one of the driest places on Earth, with rainfall almost non-existent. The Moche built sophisticated irrigation systems, channeling water from rivers into fields that supported maize, beans, squash, and cotton. These systems sustained dense populations and allowed the Moche to expand across multiple valleys. Archaeologists mapping canals and terraces today are still impressed by their scale. Without irrigation, the Moche world would have been impossible. Yet by around 700 AD, Moche society declined. The reasons remain uncertain. Climate data from lake sediments and ice cores suggest a series of powerful El Nino events struck the region in the 6th and 7th centuries. These events bring torrential rains that cause floods and destroy irrigation systems, followed by long droughts. For a society dependent on fragile desert agriculture, such swings would have been catastrophic. Archaeological evidence shows irrigation canals buried under flood deposits in some valleys. Political instability may have compounded the problem. Without a unified empire, the Moche polities may have turned on each other when resources grew scarce. Some Moche ceramics depict scenes of warfare and prisoners, suggesting conflict was already common. There is also evidence of internal upheaval. At Huaca de la Luna, murals and offerings suggest ritual responses to disasters, including human sacrifice on a large scale. These sacrifices may have been attempts to appease gods during environmental crises, but they also hint at a society under strain. The lack of a written record means we rely on material culture to interpret these events. Unlike the Maya, who left glyphs, or the Ndianwari, built vast road networks, the Moche left no inscriptions. Their ceramics, murals, and burials are their texts. Interpreting them requires caution. For example, while some vessels clearly show ritual sacrifice, scholars debate whether these depict actual practices or mythological narratives. Excavations, however, have uncovered human remains that confirm sacrificial rituals did occur, often involving young men who appear to have been war captives. One of the most remarkable discoveries came in 1987 when Peruvian archaeologist Walter Alva excavated the tomb of the Lord of Sipan in the Lambayeque Valley. This intact royal burial was compared to Tutankhamun's tomb for its wealth and preservation. The Lord was buried with gold ornaments, elaborate jewelry, warriors, and attendants. His regalia matched depictions on Moche ceramics, allowing archaeologists to link art with real individuals. Further tombs uncovered at Sipan revealed a ruling lineage, each buried with symbols of power and sacrifice. These finds transformed our understanding of Moche political structure and ritual. Other sites add more detail. At Dos Cabezas, archaeologists uncovered murals depicting supernatural beings. At San Jose de Moro, tombs of priestesses were discovered, suggesting women held important ritual roles. Their burials included fine vessels, jewelry, and evidence of ceremonial authority. This challenges earlier assumptions that Moche leadership was exclusively male. The art also preserves details of daily life. Vessels depict fishing with nets, farming maize, weaving textiles, and even medical procedures like trepanation, where holes were drilled into skulls to treat injuries or illnesses. These scenes provide glimpses of activities that would otherwise be invisible. Some vessels depict sexual acts, leading to debates about their purpose, whether they were fertility symbols, ritual depictions, or simply candid reflections of human behavior. The Moche world was tied to a larger Andean cultural trajectory. They preceded later societies like the Lambayeque, Chimu, and Inca, who inherited and expanded upon Moche irrigation systems, artistic traditions, and political models. The Chimu, for example, built Chan Chan, the largest adobe city in the world, in the same valleys once farmed by the Moche. The Inca later absorbed these coastal cultures into their empire, but the memory of the Moche themselves had already faded. Recent research continues to uncover new insights. Advances in archaeology, including isotope analysis of human remains, reveal diets rich in maize and marine protein. DNA studies show connections between coastal populations and highland groups, suggesting trade and intermarriage. Climate studies confirm that extreme El Nino events coincided with key phases of Moche decline. Still, the unanswered question remains. How did a society with such skill and organization collapse? Was it primarily climate, political fragmentation, invasion from highland cultures, or some combination? Without texts, we can't reconstruct the exact sequence. Instead, we piece together a puzzle from bones, pots, and canals. Picture the contrast. A Moche vessel, painted with a scene of a lord receiving tribute, next to a photograph of the arid Peruvian desert today. The pottery is vivid, alive with figures and color, while the landscape is dry and harsh. The gap between them is the mystery. How did a society so advanced in art, metalwork, and irrigation disappear, leaving only fragments of its story in clay and gold? And with that puzzle in mind, our path turns across the Pacific to Korea, where half a world away, another set of treasures has raised similar questions. In Korea, from the 4th to the 7th centuries AD, the rulers of the Silla kingdom were buried with crowns of pure gold, elaborate tree-like constructions that seem to balance somewhere between art, religion, and royal authority. Exquisite as they are, no one knows exactly what they meant. The Silla kingdom was one of Korea's famed three kingdoms, alongside Goguryeo and Baekje. Centered in the southeast of the peninsula, with its capital at Gyeongju, Silla began as a relatively small power, but grew into a sophisticated state with connections to China, Japan, and the wider Silk Road network. Its elites drew on local traditions and foreign influences, creating a culture both uniquely Korean and cosmopolitan. By the 6th and 7th centuries, Silla was powerful enough to unify much of the peninsula, but even before that, its tombs reflected extraordinary wealth. Excavations in Gyeongju during the 20th century uncovered large burial mounds, some up to 20 meters high, filled with grave goods that spoke of an elite class with access to immense resources. Inside these mounds, archaeologists found gold jewelry, imported glassware, fine ceramics, and, most spectacularly, crowns crafted from thin sheets of hammered gold. The crowns were unlike anything else in East Asia. They feature vertical uprights shaped like tree branches, sometimes splitting into antler-like prongs. Strips of gold hang from the sides, like streamers or pendants, shimmering as they move. Some crowns incorporate jade beads known as gogok, comma-shaped ornaments thought to symbolize fertility, vitality, or perhaps dragon scales. The delicacy of these crowns is striking. Made of incredibly thin gold, they are far too fragile to have been worn in battle or daily life. Scholars suspect they were ceremonial, worn only for rituals, or perhaps placed directly into tombs as symbols of authority. Their form suggests a shamanic or religious dimension. The tree-like uprights may represent a world tree, a concept found across Central and Northeast Asia as a symbol of the axis between heavens, earth, and the underworld. The antler-like shapes echo imagery of animals tied to fertility and hunting, Some scholars argue the crowns embody a fusion of royal and shamanic symbolism, suggesting that Scylla kings were not only political rulers, but also ritual leaders. The mystery lies in interpretation. Were the crowns purely regalia, marking the power of a king or queen? Were they ritual objects that embodied cosmic ideas, used only in ceremonies? Or were they symbols of a belief system now lost to us, combining elements of ancestor worship, shamanism, and state power? Without written records from Scylla itself, the meaning is debated. Most of what we know comes from archaeology and later historical sources compiled centuries after these crowns were made. There are fascinating details that flesh out the picture. The gold itself was likely sourced from rivers in Korea, panned and refined by skilled artisans. Hammering gold into sheets as thin as a few millimeters required advanced metallurgy, and the crowns show soldering, granulation, and other techniques that link Scylla craftsmanship to broader Eurasian traditions. Some researchers suggest the designs were influenced by nomadic steppe cultures, where gold crowns and tree motifs were also common. Others point to similarities with Scythian or Siberian regalia, carried east and south by networks of trade and migration. The gobab beads add another layer of intrigue. Found not only in crowns but also in necklaces and earrings, these jade ornaments were shaped like commas or curved talons. Their exact meaning is unclear, but they appear consistently in elite barriers, suggesting symbolic importance. Jade itself was often imported, indicating long-distance exchange networks that reached into China and perhaps beyond. High-resolution studies of the crowns reveal details invisible at first glance: tiny punched patterns, filigree work, and soldered attachments that show extraordinary precision. Visualizing them today with modern photography or museum displays allows us to see the craftsmanship in a way their makers may have intended: dazzling, intricate, and filled with symbolic weight. The crowns also tell us something about Scylla society. Their presence in tombs suggests a hierarchical structure where elites were buried with markers of their authority. But some crowns have been found in female burials, raising questions about the role of women in Scylla politics and ritual. Did queens or priestesses wear crowns as well? Were women granted equal ritual authority? The evidence suggests that power in Scylla may have been more diverse than we assume. Later historical sources, like the submicroscopic compiled in the 12th century, describe Scylla kings and their ceremonies, but by then Buddhism had become dominant, and earlier shamanic traditions had faded. The crowns may preserve a snapshot of that earlier belief system, one where rulers embodied both worldly power and spiritual mediation. What makes the crowns so compelling is how much they stand apart from contemporaneous cultures. While Chinese and Japanese regalia of the time emphasized different forms, imperial seals, swords, or mirrors, the Scylla crowns are unique in their arboreal and antlered motifs. They seem to belong to a cosmology that doesn't survive written texts. Modern discoveries continue to refine our understanding. Excavations in Gyeongju's Darungwon tomb complex, including the famous Cheonmachon, or Heavenly Horse tomb, have uncovered new artifacts that add context to the crowns. Imported glass from the Roman world, Persian silverware, and Central Asian horse gear all show how connected Scylla elites were to the wider Silk Road. The crowns, in this sense, were part of a global tapestry of elite display, even if their symbolism is locally unique. So we are left with objects of dazzling beauty, but little certainty about their meaning. Were they meant to dazzle subjects in processions? To connect kings and queens to a cosmic order? To embody shamanic traditions passed down through generations? Or were they all of these at once? The answers remain speculative, grounded in archaeology, but lacking the textual evidence that could explain them fully. Close-up views of the crowns, displayed today in museums like the National Museum of Korea, highlight the combination of gold, jade, and delicate construction. Imagine an overlay, diagrams pointing to the uprights labeled as world tree, the gogok beads labeled fertility, and the streamers interpreted as sunlight or divine energy. The visual analysis underscores the richness of the symbolism, even if the exact meaning is uncertain. The Scylla gold crowns remind us that even in a culture that left monumental tombs, art, and connections across continents, the belief systems at their core can remain obscure. Were these crowns mere ornaments or symbols of a worldview where rulers stood as shamans as well as sovereigns? The story of lost records is often one of fire, conquest, or the decay of fragile materials. But in the case of the Ming admiral Zheng He, the loss was deliberate. Zheng He commanded the largest fleet the world had ever seen, sent on missions that stretched from Southeast Asia to the east coast of Africa. And then, within a century of his death, much of his official record was erased. His treasure ships and grand expeditions, once celebrated, were reduced to fragments, leaving historians to puzzle over what the Ming court wanted forgotten and what may have been quietly suppressed. Zheng He's career began at the height of the Ming dynasty. Born Mahi at Yunnan around 1371, he was captured as a child during the Ming conquest of the region and castrated, serving as a eunuch in the imperial household. He rose to prominence under the Yongle Emperor, a ruler eager to expand China's influence. By 1405, Zheng He was appointed to command an extraordinary fleet on the first of what would be 7 state-sponsored voyages between 1405 and 1433. The scale was unprecedented. Contemporary sources described 320 ships leaving China's ports, some of them treasure ships estimated at nearly 400 feet long, more than 4 times the length of Columbus's Santa Maria, which would not sail for another century. Even if we take the most conservative estimates, the vessels were enormous, multi-decked, and capable of carrying thousands of crew and vast cargoes of silk, porcelain, and other goods. The fleet may have included 27,000 men on its first voyage, sailors, soldiers, interpreters, doctors, and officials. Over the course of 7 expeditions, Zheng He led his fleet across the South China Sea, through the Strait of Malacca, across the Indian Ocean, and as far west as the Swahili coast of Africa. Stops included Shanghai in present-day Vietnam, Java, Sumatra, Malacca, Ceylon, Sri Lanka, Calicut, and Cochin in India, Hormuz in the Persian Gulf, and Mogadishu and Malindi in East Africa. The voyages were not about conquest, but diplomacy and trade. Zheng He's fleet carried lavish gifts for foreign rulers and brought back exotic goods, giraffes and zebras from Africa, spices from Southeast Asia, and pearls and gemstones from the Indian Ocean. The achievements were remarkable. Zheng He brokered alliances, collected tribute, and established Ming prestige across half the known world. In Calicut, the fleet set up a permanent base of operations. In Sri Lanka, inscriptions carved by Zheng He himself survive in trilingual form: Chinese, Tamil, and Persian, recording offerings made to local deities. These voyages tied China into a vast web of Indian Ocean trade and reinforced the idea that the Ming dynasty was the dominant power of its age. Yet for all their grandeur, many details are missing. After Zheng He's death in 1433, political winds shifted. The Ming court turned inward. Subsequent emperors saw little reason to continue the costly expeditions, which they deemed extravagant. China faced threats from nomadic groups on its northern borders, and resources were redirected to defense and domestic stability. By the mid-15th century, construction of the Great Wall was renewed with vigor, while the massive shipyards at Nanjing fell silent. What makes this story striking is that the erasure appears intentional. Records of Zheng He's voyages, the logs, the detailed maps, the lists of contacts and goods, were systematically destroyed or neglected. Official histories minimized his achievements. The Ming Shilu, or veritable records of the Ming, mention the voyages but provide only brief accounts. Some scholars argue that the voyages were suppressed to discourage future emperors from reviving costly overseas ventures that conflicted with a Confucian ideal of agrarian stability and self-sufficiency. In effect, China's rulers chose to forget. The fragments that remain are tantalizing. Stone inscriptions survive in Sri Lanka, recording Zheng He's presence. In Calicut, accounts from local rulers mention his fleet. Some maps attributed to the Ming era, like the controversial Maokun map, show detailed knowledge of Indian Ocean ports, but the daily records, the ship logs, the cargo lists, the diplomatic correspondence are gone. Without them, we can only sketch the broad outlines of what must have been extraordinary encounters between China and the wider world. There are fascinating tidbits. The treasure ships, if their reported size is accurate, were not equaled until the 20th century, when steel replaced wood as the dominant shipbuilding material. Some carried freshwater tanks, gardens for growing vegetables, and compartments for transporting animals. Accounts describe the fleet returning with giraffes, which the Ming court marveled at as killing, mythical creatures symbolizing good fortune. The scale of the voyages dwarfed contemporary expeditions in Europe. When Columbus crossed the Atlantic in 1492, he commanded 3 small ships and fewer than 100 men, a fraction of Zhenghe's resources. Myths have grown around the missing records. Some claim Zhenghe reached the Americas decades before Columbus, citing the controversial 1421 map promoted in the early 2000s. While most scholars dismiss this as speculative, the lack of complete records means the debate never fully dies. What is clear is that Zhenghe reached East Africa, and some evidence suggests his fleet may have gone even further, perhaps exploring islands deep into the Indian Ocean. Without the lost documents, the full range of his voyages remains uncertain. The reasons for the erasure point to Ming politics. Confucian officials distrusted eunuchs like Zhenghe, whose influence under the Yongle Emperor they resented. By suppressing records of his voyages, later bureaucrats could diminish his legacy and restore the ideological focus on China's agrarian heartland. There was also a practical motive. Overseas expeditions drained resources and opened China to foreign entanglements that conservative officials preferred to avoid. Forgetting Zheng. It was a way of reinforcing the vision of China as self-contained, strong behind its walls, uninterested in maritime adventure. Visualization brings the contrast home. Imagine Columbus's Santa Maria beside a Ming treasure ship, the European vessel barely reaching the height of the other ship's deck. Then imagine a map of the Indian Ocean, dotted with ports where Zhenghe's fleet left gifts, carved inscriptions, and diplomatic ties. Now picture a bonfire in a Ming archive, with detailed logs and charts fed into the flames. The irony is that even without records, Zhenghe's legacy endured in fragments across Asia. Oral traditions in Malacca, Sri Lanka, and East Africa remember the visits of a great Chinese fleet. Archaeological finds of Chinese ceramics across the Indian Ocean testify to the Ming presence. And yet, in China itself, his story faded until modern historians began piecing it back together from surviving references. So the question remains, what discoveries did Zhenghe make that were considered so threatening? Later rulers erased them from history. Were there maps of lands beyond Africa? Records of scientific exchanges or unfamiliar cultures? Lists of tribute and gifts that undermined the narrative of a self-sufficient China? Without the missing documents, we can only speculate. And with Zhenghe's missing records, our journey turns again. This time it takes us not to the decks of treasure ships, but into the libraries of missionaries. In the 16th and 17th centuries, Jesuits in China recorded everything they saw in encyclopedic detail: politics, science, customs. And yet, much of their work was confiscated or hidden away. The lost records of the Jesuit China mission are another case where history was written down in detail, only to slip out of reach. For nearly 200 years, Jesuit missionaries in China recorded everything they saw: science, religion, politics, customs, and much of it has disappeared. The Jesuit mission to China began in 1582, when Matteo Ricci, an Italian priest, arrived in Macau. Unlike earlier missionaries, who tried to convert through preaching alone, Ricci and his companions adopted a strategy of cultural exchange. They learned Chinese, wore the robes of Confucian scholars, and presented European science as a way to gain entry into Chinese elite circles. Their gifts included clocks, prisms, mathematical instruments, and most famously, world maps. Ricci's 1602 map of the world placed China at the center, a symbolic gesture that won favor at court, while simultaneously reshaping European geographic knowledge. The Jesuits quickly became known as cultural brokers. They introduced Western astronomy, cartography, hydraulics, and calendar reform, while in turn translating Confucian classics into Latin for European readers. They documented Chinese rituals, philosophy, and daily life in letters that circulated across Europe, sparking fascination with what many saw as a sophisticated, ancient civilization. The Jesuits wrote encyclopedic works in both Chinese and Latin, trying to bridge cultures. The records they produced were immense. Jesuit letters describe audiences with Ming and later Qing emperors, noting the rituals of the Forbidden City and the bureaucracy of the imperial court. They observed everything from how tea was prepared to how examinations were administered. Their reports on Chinese law, family structure, and philosophy influenced Enlightenment thinkers like Leibniz, Voltaire, and Montesquieu. Jesuit maps blended Chinese and European cartography, creating hybrid visions of the world that informed both sides. Yet much of this documentation is missing. When the Kangxi Emperor first tolerated, then patronized the Jesuits in the late 1600s, the mission flourished. But by the early 18th century, the so-called Chinese rites controversy, a dispute over whether Confucian ancestor worship could be considered compatible with Christianity, led to papal bans and imperial crackdowns. The Qing state eventually outlawed Christian practice, confiscating manuscripts and expelling many missionaries. Some documents were burned outright. Others were shipped to Europe, where they disappeared into archives, untranslated or forgotten. This means that while we have some famous works, such as Ricci's diaries and the massive Confucius Sinara Philosophies, Confucius, Philosopher of the Chinese, printed in 1687, countless other letters, treatises, and translations are inaccessible. Some may still sit in the Vatican Library or Jesuit collections in Portugal, Spain, and France, uncatalogued or unread. The scale of what is missing is impossible to calculate. There are fascinating fragments that survived. Jesuit astronomers at the Beijing Observatory left detailed records of eclipse observations and planetary movements. Letters from figures like Ferdinand Verbiest describe building fountains and casting cannons for the Kangxi Emperor. Maps commissioned by Jesuits integrated Chinese knowledge of Central Asia with European measurements, changing how the West understood Asia's geography. These maps often placed China literally at the center of the world, a reversal of earlier Eurocentric traditions. Some of the letters offer rare outsider perspectives on life inside the Forbidden City. Jesuits noted the rhythms of court life, the emperor's processions, banquets, and rituals of obeisance. They recorded details of clothing, etiquette, and architecture that Chinese chroniclers often took for granted. They also described common life outside the palace, bustling markets, harvest festivals, marriage customs, giving Europe a textured view of Chinese society that challenged stereotypes. The influence of these records in Europe was enormous. Philosophers and scientists cited them as evidence that China was a model of rational governance, secular morality, and scientific curiosity. Voltaire praised Confucian ethics as superior to Europe's religious quarrels. Leibniz argued that Europe and China were two poles of human wisdom, destined to learn from one another. Jesuit reports fueled the Enlightenment's image of China, even as the records themselves were selectively edited and sometimes censored. The gaps, however, are striking. We know Jesuits wrote dictionaries in Chinese dialects, medical treatises comparing European and Chinese medicine, and detailed descriptions of provinces. Many of these are missing or survive only in partial references. What happened to the volumes confiscated during the Qing bans? How many manuscripts were destroyed? And how many languished unread in archives? The absence leaves historians struggling to reconstruct the full extent of the mission. There are intriguing tidbits that highlight both what survived and what didn't. Ricci's 1602 map survives in only a handful of copies, treasured in collections today. Jesuit calendars, once central to Ming and Qing astronomy, were largely discarded after the missionaries fell out of favor. Letters from missionaries in provincial towns hint at records of local customs that were never published. Some later accounts mention warehouses of confiscated manuscripts, their fate unknown. Visualization makes the contrast vivid. Picture a European world map before reaching, with China as a distant edge, then his 1602 map with China firmly in the middle. Next, imagine rows of manuscripts in the Forbidden City seized and carted away, their contents unrecorded. Or picture a European salon where Voltaire reads from a Jesuit letter describing Chinese meritocratic exams, using it as a critique of aristocratic privilege. The surviving texts shaped global history, but what about those that never made it out of China, or never made it into print? The mystery is how much of China's story, filtered through Jesuit eyes, still sits hidden. Did Jesuits record events or customs that no Chinese chronicler wrote down? Did they preserve dialects or rituals now extinct? Did they note observations of court politics that could reshape our understanding of Ming and Qing governance? Without access to the missing records, these questions remain open. For nearly 200 years, Jesuits in China recorded in extraordinary detail a society at its peak of global power, then saw much of that work suppressed or scattered. The fragments that remain influenced Enlightenment Europe and changed how the West thought about China, but the missing manuscripts suggest there is still much to uncover. The Jesuits' missing records remind us how easy it is for centuries of meticulous documentation to slip into obscurity. But sometimes history isn't erased in libraries or archives. Sometimes it's swallowed whole by the land itself. For centuries, the Amazon was dismissed as a green desert, a vast rainforest too poor in soil to support large-scale societies. Early reports of cities and organized civilizations along the Great River were ridiculed as fantasy. And yet, modern science and archaeology are proving those early witnesses might have been right. New evidence shows that the Amazon was once home to millions of people, living in complex urban networks that re-engineered the forest itself. The first tantalizing hint came from the 16th century. In 1542, the Spanish explorer Francisco de Orellana became the first European to navigate the length of the Amazon River. His reports described densely populated settlements, connected villages, and organized societies living along the riverbanks. He claimed to have seen great towns, markets, and fields. His descriptions shocked readers back in Europe. How could such an environment, hot, humid, and seemingly inhospitable, support so many people? But Orellana's account was quickly dismissed. Later expeditions found no such cities, and scholars concluded he had exaggerated or simply fabricated the story to boost his reputation. For centuries, his account was treated as little more than tall tales. The dismissal seemed to make sense. The Amazon's soil is famously poor in nutrients. Conventional wisdom held that it could not sustain large populations dependent on agriculture. Anthropologists argued that indigenous communities must always have been small, scattered, and semi-nomadic. The myth of the Green Desert, an ecosystem lush in biodiversity but hostile to complex societies, dominated academic thinking well into the 20th century. That narrative began to crack with the discovery of terra preta, or black earth, a man-made soil found in patches across the Amazon. Unlike the natural leached soils of the region, terra preta is rich in nutrients, dark, and capable of sustaining crops for centuries. Analysis showed it was deliberately created by mixing charcoal, organic waste, and pottery shards into the soil. Indigenous communities had effectively engineered their own farmland, turning poor soils into productive plots. Terra preta isn't found in isolated pockets. It covers vast areas, sometimes hundreds of hectares, suggesting large populations cultivating organized landscapes. Further evidence came from above. Beginning in the late 20th century, deforestation in parts of Brazil exposed mysterious earthworks, ditches, embankments, and geometric shapes carved into the ground. Many are circles, squares, or interconnected patterns, sometimes stretching for hundreds of meters. These geoglyphs were invisible under forest canopy, preserved for centuries, but once cleared, their scale became undeniable. Archaeologists dated many of them to between 1000 and 1500 AD, centuries before European contact. They pointed to organized labor, coordinated planning, and a population dense enough to undertake monumental projects. The real breakthrough came from LiDAR technology, laser scanning mounted on aircraft that can penetrate forest canopy and map the ground below. In recent years, LiDAR surveys over the Amazon have revealed grids of roads, plazas, and city layouts hidden under dense jungle. In Acre, Brazil, researchers mapped dozens of interconnected settlements with causeways linking. Some were arranged in geometric precision, with central plazas surrounded by residential areas. These were not isolated villages. They were parts of dense urban networks, comparable in complexity to city systems elsewhere in the pre-Columbian Americas. The emerging picture is of an Amazon that supported millions of people before European contact. Instead of a single empire, as in the Andes with the Inca, the Amazon seems to have been home to regional clusters of societies, connected by trade, shared technologies, and engineered landscapes. They built not only fields, but also fish farms, with channels and ponds designed to trap and breed fish. Orchards of fruit trees were cultivated systematically, blending agriculture with forest management. The rainforest itself may, in part, be a human creation, a managed landscape shaped over centuries by indigenous planting and pruning. So what happened? Why did later explorers see only scattered groups in small villages? The answer lies in the catastrophe of European contact. Diseases like smallpox, influenza, and measles tore through indigenous populations long before most Europeans set foot in the interior. Carried by trade, early coastal contact, epidemics spread faster than explorers themselves. Mortality rates may have reached 80 or 90% in some regions. By the time later expeditions ventured inland, the societies Orellana described were gone, their survivors scattered into smaller groups. The great networks had collapsed, leaving behind only fragments. There are intriguing tidbits that flesh out this picture. Some LiDAR scans show villages linked by causeways, radiating outward like spokes from a wheel, suggesting coordinated political centers. Archaeologists have found remnants of artificial mounds and raised fields and floodplains designed to protect crops from seasonal flooding. Fish weirs and canals show a deep understanding of aquatic ecosystems. The Amazon wasn't just lived in, it was engineered. Visualization makes the change striking. Imagine a LiDAR scan revealing perfect squares and circles carved into the earth, then overlay that on today's dense forest. To the naked eye, there is only endless green. But underneath are traces of cities, roads, and engineered fields. Pair that with Orellana's account of bustling towns, and suddenly his fantasies look more like eyewitness testimony. The mystery now isn't whether large Amazonian civilizations existed. Evidence confirms they did. But how much of them remains hidden? Archaeologists believe only a fraction of the region has been surveyed with LiDAR. Given the Amazon's size, 2.7 million square miles, there may be hundreds of undiscovered city networks still buried beneath the canopy. Every year brings new finds, more geoglyphs, more terra preta, more hints of orchards and farms. The erased history of the Amazon is only beginning to be rewritten. It's worth noting how these discoveries change our understanding of indigenous knowledge. For centuries, colonial accounts dismissed Amazonian peoples as primitive. Now, their ancestors are recognized as skilled engineers who reshaped one of the world's most complex ecosystems. The tragedy is that epidemics and conquest erased so much of their memory that modern descendants were left disconnected from much of this past. The story of the Amazon's hidden civilizations reminds us that landscapes we think of as wild or untouched were often engineered by human hands. A similar revelation has transformed how we understand Cambodia's past. Angkor Wat, is famous worldwide as a temple, a stone masterpiece rising out of the jungle. But the temple was only the centerpiece of a far greater achievement. Angkor was part of a city powered by one of the largest and most sophisticated water systems ever built in the pre-modern world. Its network of reservoirs, canals, and embankments was so vast that it supported nearly 1 million people at the height of the Khmer Empire. And yet, by the 15th century, this empire collapsed, leaving its capital abandoned and overgrown. The question is, how could a civilization that mastered water let it become the very thing that brought it down? The Khmer Empire rose in the 9th century under Jayavarman II, who declared himself a universal monarch and established a new capital in the Angkor region of northwestern Cambodia. Over the centuries that followed, his successors expanded Angkor into one of the largest urban complexes of the medieval. At its peak, Angkor stretched across nearly 400 square kilometers, a sprawl larger than many modern cities. It was sustained not by fertile plains alone, but by engineering that turned the unpredictable monsoon into a reliable resource. The Khmer built gigantic reservoirs known as parades.
Crystallizing.
The East Parade, constructed in the 10th century, measured about 7 kilometers long and 2 kilometers wide. The later West Parade was even larger, 8 by 2 kilometers, with a capacity of over 50 million cubic meters of water. To put that in perspective, these reservoirs were larger than modern airports and visible from space. Canals connected the parades to rivers and redistributed water across rice fields. Embankments and dikes regulated floods, while channels redirected surplus water to storage basins. The result was a system that allowed farmers to grow multiple rice crops per year, feeding a dense urban population and supporting monumental construction. The scale of this achievement cannot be overstated. Medieval Angkor was a metropolis, rivaling the largest cities of the world. Its temples, Angkor Wat, Baiwa, Ta Prohm, are architectural wonders, but they were made possible by the hydraulic engine that sustained the empire's economy. LiDAR surveys conducted in the 21st century have revealed suburbs and neighborhoods hidden under the forest canopy, showing that Angkor was not just a collection of temples, but a true city with roads, houses, and fields. Archaeologists estimate that nearly 1 million people lived in and around Angkor during its peak, making it one of the most populated places on Earth in its time. But by the 15th century, Angkor's power had crumbled. The city was gradually abandoned, and the Khmer court shifted south toward Phnom Penh. What caused the collapse has long been debated. One major factor is climate. Studies of tree rings and lake sediments show that the region experienced decades of alternating droughts and floods during the 14th and 15th centuries. In dry years, canals and reservoirs ran low, unable to irrigate rice fields. In wet years, torrential floods overwhelmed embankments and destroyed infrastructure. Angkor's system, designed for stability, struggled to cope with extremes. There is evidence that the very scale of the water system made it fragile. Over centuries, canals had been expanded, diverted, and patched in increasingly complex ways. Some archaeologists argue that the system became over-engineered, too rigid to adapt to sudden changes. When drought cracked the earth and floods tore through embankments, the repairs may have been beyond the state's capacity, especially as political unrest grew. Instability within the empire likely compounded environmental stress. By the late 13th century, Angkor was facing external threats from neighboring kingdoms such as Ayutthaya in present-day Thailand. Inscriptions and Chinese accounts describe wars, shifting alliances, and dynastic rivalries. Maintaining vast parades and temples required centralized authority and resources. Once political control weakened, so too did the ability to sustain the hydraulic system. The collapse of Angkor wasn't a single dramatic fall, but a slow unraveling. Temples remained active into the 15th and 16th centuries, but the city's population dwindled as people moved south to areas less dependent on the fragile water network. The forests reclaimed the suburbs, and Angkor became a symbolic rather than political center. When French explorers rediscovered it in the 19th century, they found colossal ruins tangled with roots and vines, the remnants of an empire undone by the very system that had once made it great. Modern archaeology adds fascinating tidbits. LiDAR surveys have mapped suburbs stretching for kilometers, complete with gridded roads and ponds. Some reservoirs were so vast that they rivaled modern dams in capacity, yet their remains are now silent basins overgrown with vegetation. Excavations show evidence of rushed repairs, collapsed canal walls filled with hastily laid stone, suggesting frantic attempts to patch the system during environmental crises. At Angkor Thom, inscriptions reveal that workers were conscripted to maintain waterways, showing how central the system was to both the economy and state control. Visualization drives the point home. Imagine an animation of the monsoon filling the Great Berets, water coursing through canals into green fields, temples glittering on the horizon. Then imagine the rains faltering for years, reservoirs dropping, crops withering. Suddenly the monsoon returns with fury, floods tearing through dikes, washing away soil. The same system that once fed 1 million people buckles, leaving Angkor exposed to hunger, unrest, and invasion. The story of Angkor's hydraulic collapse is not one of ignorance, but of brilliance pushed to its limits. The Khmer mastered water on a scale few societies ever achieved, but their success bred vulnerability. When the climate shifted and politics fractured, the system that had supported their greatness became the burden that hastened their decline. How could a civilization that mastered water let it become the very thing that destroyed them? While Cambodia's story is written in stone and canals, Arabia's earlier history is much harder to trace. Here the challenge isn't crumbling infrastructure or jungle overgrowth. It's centuries of neglect and erasure. Before Islam, Arabia was home to powerful kingdoms, monumental temples, and scripts carved across cliffs and valleys. For a long time, this history was overlooked, dismissed as a prelude to the Islamic period. Only recently have archaeologists begun piecing together the stories of Arabia's forgotten rulers, and the picture that's emerging is far richer than we once imagined. Arabia between 500 BC and 600 AD wasn't the cultural backwater it was often portrayed as. It was a patchwork of kingdoms and tribes, some small and local, others large enough to play significant roles in global politics. To the north were the Nabateans, whose capital at Petra controlled trade routes from the Red Sea up into the Levant. They carved monumental facades into sandstone cliffs and left behind inscriptions in their distinctive script. To the south, the Himyarite kingdom in modern-day Yemen grew wealthy from maritime links across the Indian Ocean and land-based incense caravans. In northwest Arabia, the Lehianites ruled from Data, building fortresses and temples that rivaled those of their northern neighbors. Each of these powers rose and fell long before the rise of Islam, shaping the peninsula in ways we're only now beginning to understand. Evidence of these societies lies scattered across the desert. Thousands of inscriptions in Old South Arabian, Safavidic, Thamudic, and other scripts are carved into cliffs and rock faces across Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Yemen. Some are prayers to local gods, others dedications to kings or markers of territory. Archaeologists working at Al-Ula have uncovered monumental tombs with facades similar to Petra's, reflecting the shared cultural sphere of northwestern Arabia. Temples in Yemen dedicated to deities like Al-Maka and Athtar show that religious traditions were both diverse and elaborate. Fortresses along caravan routes reveal a level of organization and control that belies the stereotype of Arabia as purely tribal. Despite this wealth of material, Arabia's pre-Islamic past remains a mystery in many ways. Part of the reason is that much of its record was ignored or suppressed after the rise of Islam in the 7th century. Early Muslim chroniclers often referred to the period before Muhammad as Jahiliyyah, the age of ignorance, emphasizing the transformation that Islam brought rather than the complexity of what came before. Temples and inscriptions were left to decay or were actively destroyed as pagan relics. Oral traditions about earlier kings and dynasties faded, and when Islamic historians did write about pre-Islamic Arabia, they tended to focus on genealogies tied to the prophet's lineage rather than on the independent history of kingdoms like Himyar or Lihian. The incense trade underscores Arabia's role in the ancient world. Frankincense and myrrh, harvested in the south, were highly prized in Roman temples, Jewish rituals, and Christian ceremonies. Caravans carried these goods north through a network of oases and forts, generating immense wealth for kingdoms that controlled the routes. Roman authors complained about how much gold flowed eastward in exchange for Arabian aromatics. Archaeological remains of caravan stations, wells, and storage depots confirmed the scale of this trade. It wasn't just incense. Arabia also supplied horses, textiles, and agricultural produce, linking it firmly to the economic systems of Rome, Persia, and India. There are fascinating tidbits that add depth to the picture. Inscriptions at Tema, an oasis town in northern Arabia, mention kings and rulers who interacted with empires to the north. Classical sources note that the Nabatean king Aretas IV controlled territory that stretched from Damascus to the Red Sea. In Yemen, the Himyarites at times allied with the Persians and Ethiopians, drawing Arabia into the conflicts of the wider Near East. Byzantine writers described Arabian tribes as foederati, client allies who fought in Rome's wars. These references, combined with inscriptions in the desert itself, reveal Arabia as a dynamic player in late antiquity, not a forgotten corner. Yet so much of this history remains untranslated or unexamined. Tens of thousands of inscriptions have been cataloged in photographs, but never fully studied. Safavidic graffiti, short inscriptions carved by nomads across basalt deserts in Syria, Jordan, and northern Saudi Arabia, number in the tens of thousands, offering glimpses into daily life, prayers, and migrations. But their sheer volume has overwhelmed scholars, and many remain unstudied. Some old South Arabian texts mention dynasties and lineages otherwise unknown. Without systematic study, countless stories remain hidden in plain sight on Arabia's cliffs. Visualization helps illustrate this erasure. Picture a desert cliff, face covered in ancient graffiti, prayers to gods long forgotten, records of alliances and battles. Now contrast that with Quranic inscriptions carved centuries later into nearby rocks, the older scripts fading into obscurity as the new faith reshaped the cultural landscape. Or imagine the incense caravans, long lines of camels carrying resin jars northward, guarded by soldiers from Himyarite forts, their routes stretching to Roman Syria. These are images of Arabia that complicate the common picture of desert tribes awaiting revelation. The erasure of pre-Islamic Arabia leaves us with tantalizing gaps. What myths were told in the temples of Al-Makka? What records of battles and dynasties lay hidden in inscriptions not yet translated? What forgotten kings once negotiated with Rome and Persia, shaping the politics of late antiquity from the Arabian Peninsula? The evidence shows they existed, but their stories were never fully written down, or were deliberately left out of later chronicles. So Arabia before Islam was not an empty desert, but a crossroads of kingdoms, cultures, and economies. The challenge is that its record is fragmented, overshadowed by what came after. What forgotten kings and cultures once ruled Arabia before their stories were erased? The forgotten kingdoms of Arabia remind us how entire cultures can be overshadowed by later history. But sometimes the problem isn't erasure by successors. It's that a civilization left no written record in the first place. In Central Asia, beneath the deserts and plains of Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and northern Afghanistan, archaeologists in the 1970s uncovered the traces of a Bronze Age culture with monumental fortresses, intricate jewelry, ritual fire altars, and artifacts linking it to trade networks that spanned thousands of miles. Yet, it had no writing, no known name, and no remembered history. Today, it's known only by a modern archaeological label, the Bactria Margiana Archaeological Complex, or BMAC. The discovery came during Soviet excavations in the early 1970s. Archaeologist Viktor Saryanity led digs at sites that had long been little more than mounds of sand. What he and his team uncovered changed the understanding of Central Asia's past. In the Murgab River delta of Turkmenistan, they found Goner Tepe, a sprawling city with fortified walls, palaces, temples, and burial grounds. Dozens of similar sites soon came to light across Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Afghanistan, revealing an entire Bronze Age civilization that had gone unrecorded by neighbors like Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley. The finds were striking. At Goner Tepe and other settlements, archaeologists uncovered massive mud brick fortresses with walls several meters thick, towers at intervals, and carefully planned gates. Inside were palatial complexes with multiple courtyards and residential quarters. This wasn't a scattering of villages. It was a highly organized society with urban planning and centralized authority. Artifacts from these sites revealed skilled craftsmanship. Jewelry made of gold, silver, and semi-precious stones was found in burials, often accompanying elite individuals. Beads of lapis lazuli, a stone mined in Afghanistan, appeared alongside carnelian from the Indus Valley and turquoise from Iran, proof of wide-ranging trade connections. Metalworking was advanced with copper and bronze tools, weapons, and ornaments, showing careful alloying and shaping. Figurines of humans and animals, often in stylized or abstract forms, were distinctive compared to neighboring cultures. Some depict women with exaggerated features, possibly connected to fertility rituals. Perhaps the most intriguing finds were ritual installations. At Goner Tepe, archaeologists uncovered fire altars, circular or rectangular platforms, with traces of ash and burnt offerings. These bear resemblance to later Zoroastrian fire temples, raising questions about whether the Oxus people were early Indo-Iranians, or at least influenced by traditions that would later shape Persian religion. Other structures, like water channels and basins, suggest ceremonial use of water. Together, the altars and basins point to a complex spiritual life centered on fire and purification. And yet, for all this, the Oxus civilization left no written texts. Unlike Mesopotamia's cuneiform or the Indus Valley's seals, no system of writing has been found at BMAC sites. This absence leaves archaeologists guessing about the people's language, political organization, and beliefs. Who ruled these fortresses? Were they kings, priestly elites, or tribal confederations? Did they have myths, laws, or literature? Without inscriptions, the answers are lost. The mystery deepens when considering connections to other civilizations. The BMAC was roughly contemporary with the Indus Valley civilization to the south and Mesopotamia to the west. Artifacts suggest contact. Mesopotamian texts mention trade with a region called Marhasi or Margiana, which may refer to the Oxus world. Indus-style carnelian beads turn up at BMAC sites, while BMAC artifacts appear in Iranian plateau settlements. Some scholars suggest the Oxus culture was a middle link in long-distance trade, stretching from India to Mesopotamia. Others propose that BMAC people were ancestors of Indo-Iranian groups who later migrated south into Iran and north into the steppes, carrying religious traditions with them. Tidbits from the finds highlight the puzzle. Gold cups decorated with geometric patterns. Echo motifs seen later in Persian art. Beads of lapis from Afghanistan show up in tombs as far away as Mesopotamia, suggesting Oxus merchants played a key role in moving goods. BMAC figurines are distinct, squat, stylized, often female, unlike the more naturalistic art of the Indus Valley or Mesopotamia. The architecture of the fortresses, with thick, defensive walls, suggests a society concerned with protection. But from whom? Did they face nomadic raiders from the steppe or rival city-states? Reconstructing the culture's appearance is challenging, but visualizations help. Imagine Goner Tepe in its prime. Mud brick walls rising above the desert, towers lining the fortifications, smoke rising from ceremonial fires within temple precincts, traders moving in with caravans of lapis and carnelian, artisans hammering gold into ornaments. From above, the city looks like a carefully planned rectangle of walls, streets, an oasis of order in the desert. The decline of the Oxus civilization is as mysterious as its origins. By around 1700 BC, most of the sites were abandoned. Environmental changes may have played a role. Shifts in river channels could have dried up irrigation sources in the Bergen Delta. Some evidence suggests incursions from steppe peoples, whose mobile lifestyles may have disrupted settled societies. Another possibility is integration. The Oxus people may have merged into neighboring cultures, leaving their fortresses behind, but carrying traditions that influenced later Indo-Iranian religions and societies. Modern research continues to shed light. Excavations at sites like Togolok and Dashley have added more details of BMAC architecture and ritual. Isotope analysis of human remains shows buried diets, suggesting social stratification and possible long-distance migration. Genetic studies hint at connections between BMAC populations and both steppe nomads and South Asian groups, reinforcing the idea of Central Asia as a crossroads. Still, the big questions remain unanswered. Who were the rulers of these fortress cities? What language did they speak? Did they contribute directly to Zoroastrian traditions? Or did their fire altars represent a parallel but independent belief system? And how much of their history was lost simply because they left no writing? History isn't just the story of what we've uncovered. It's also a patchwork of gaps, erasures, and mysteries that remind us how much remains out of reach. Across this journey, we've looked at everything from the earliest scratches of proto-whiting to the blank centuries in our records, from civilizations that built vast cities only to disappear into jungle or desert, to entire libraries of knowledge that were burned or deliberately erased. Some tales are clear, others are half-remembered, and many more are missing altogether. And maybe that's what makes history so captivating. Not just what we found, but the countless possibilities still hidden in the ruins, the archives, and the landscapes waiting to be explored. So now it's your turn. Which missing history fascinates you the most? Drop your theories in the comments, and I'll be replying to my favorite ones. Make sure to check out our channel for more videos exploring our lost past. And as always, however, the most intriguing and controversial aspect of the Piri race map across the globe are artifacts that leave experts scratching their heads, objects that seem impossible, out of place, or simply beyond explanation. These mysterious relics, found tucked away in ancient tombs, hidden beneath layers of earth, or submerged beneath waves for thousands of years, refuse to give up their secrets easily. Today we're exploring 20 of history's most puzzling artifacts, perfectly crafted swords that have stayed sharp and rust-free for thousands of years, strange ancient discs whose purposes remain unclear, daggers forged from fallen meteorites, dusty scrolls filled with unknown symbols, and ancient technology we still don't understand. Each one has sparked theories, debates, and countless attempts to uncover their origins. We'll look at what makes these artifacts special, strange, or downright baffling. As always with our videos, the visuals are here to provide extra context, but they're not necessary. So whether you're watching closely or just listening in the background, settle in, grab a snack, relax, and enjoy the fascinating stories behind these puzzling objects. Now let's explore 20 ancient discoveries we simply can't explain. In the world of archaeology, many discoveries are straightforward. Beautiful pottery, golden jewelry, or perhaps a clear-cut royal tomb. But occasionally, archaeologists find something so strange and out of place, it feels as though the past itself is teasing us. This is precisely the case with the Sabu disc, an odd artifact whose unusual shape and purpose have puzzled experts since its discovery. The story begins back in 1936, in the heart of Egypt's vast, sandy desert. Renowned British Egyptologist Walter Bryan Emery was excavating the tomb of Prince Sabu, a nobleman who lived roughly around 3,100 to 3000 BC during Egypt's very early dynastic period. Emery and his team carefully cleared away sand and rubble, uncovering the tomb step by step until they stumbled across a small, unassuming chamber. Inside lay various objects befitting a royal burial: pottery vessels, ivory jewelry, and bronze tools. Yet resting quietly among these familiar items was an artifact that immediately stood out: a peculiar disc, unlike anything previously seen. Carved meticulously from a single block of schist, a soft yet delicately layered stone, this artifact, now known as the Sabu disc, looked anything but ordinary. Measuring roughly 61 centimeters in diameter, it was surprisingly thin and fragile, considering the hardness of stone. But even more intriguing was its curious shape. At the center was a hole, surrounded delicately layered stone. This artifact, now known as the Sabu disc, looked anything but ordinary. Measuring roughly 61 centimeters in diameter, it was surprisingly thin and fragile, considering the hardness of stone. But even more intriguing was its curious shape. At the center was a hole, surrounded by three thin, gracefully curved blades, evenly spaced and delicately tapered. The entire disc rested on a slender lip, elevating it slightly from whatever surface it was meant to sit upon. To visualize it clearly, imagine a steering wheel combined oddly with a propeller, something you'd expect more from a modern workshop rather than an ancient Egyptian tomb. Its craftsmanship was undoubtedly sophisticated, reflecting a high degree of skill. Whoever created this disc didn't just possess talent, they understood how to handle stone delicately, carving precise curves and maintaining perfect symmetry. Given its unique appearance, the Sabu disc quickly attracted attention, and equally quickly, experts began speculating about its purpose. Archaeologists, historians, and even enthusiasts in various backgrounds have offered theories ranging from plausible to downright imaginative. One of the most common theories suggests that the disc might have served a ceremonial or symbolic function. Ancient Egypt, after all, was a culture steeped in symbolism, and artifacts often represented ideas or beliefs rather than practical everyday use. The disc's careful construction and unusual form could represent a symbolic vessel, perhaps something that held ritual significance or was displayed during special occasions or ceremonies. However, skeptics of this theory point out that ceremonial items usually carry clearer symbolism or are accompanied by imagery or hieroglyphs, helping experts decipher their meaning. Yet, the Sabu disc bears no inscriptions, no known symbolic carvings, nothing that explicitly identifies its purpose. Thus, if it were indeed ceremonial, its meaning is deeply hidden or lost entirely. This absence of clear symbolism has led other experts to propose a more practical function. Some suggest it might have been a mechanical phenomenon, perhaps part of a larger device. Its carefully balanced shape and blades indeed give it an appearance reminiscent of a fan or propeller. Supporters of this idea propose it could have been attached to a central axle, spinning as part of some ancient mechanism, perhaps for mixing or ventilating air. Although fascinating, this theory struggles with historical context. As far as we know, no mechanical devices or similar rotating artifacts have been found from such an early period in ancient Egypt, leaving this hypothesis speculative at best. On the more conservative side, some archaeologists have suggested it might simply be a decorative object, an impressive display piece made by an artisan demonstrating skill, wealth, or status. Ancient Egyptians were fond of creating objects solely for their aesthetic beauty or as a symbol of power, without any additional practical function. However, critics of this theory ask a valid question. Why create something so intricate, so delicate, so technically demanding merely as decoration? The disc's complexity seems excessive for something that simply sat on a shelf or adorned a tomb. Adding further to its mystery,
Wow,
modern
how is it
engineers and
that
stone
dense
carvers have
That's
waited,
what?
attempting to recreate the disc using only ancient techniques and tools. These attempts highlight just how challenging the Sabu disc's craftsmanship is. Achieving the precise curves, uniform thickness, and overall balance is not only time-consuming, but incredibly difficult, even with modern equipment. This raises intriguing questions about the skills and techniques of early Egyptian artisans, hinting that their knowledge of stone carving was far more advanced than previously thought. Today, the Sabu disc resides in Cairo's Egyptian Museum, displayed prominently yet quietly puzzling visitors and researchers alike. Despite numerous studies and countless hours of debate, its true purpose remains unknown, making it one of ancient Egypt's genuine unsolved mysteries. Visitors to the museum often pause by the disc case, peering thoughtfully at this odd stone disc, captivated by its strange elegance, and quietly amused by its defiance of clear explanation. For archaeologists and historians, the Sabu disc represents both the joy and frustration inherent in their work. Each new artifact offers a piece of the puzzle, a window into ancient life. Yet occasionally, artifacts like this one appear, pieces that refuse to fit me, challenging our understanding and reminding us of how much still lies undiscovered. Perhaps someday, another excavation in the shifting sands of Egypt might unearth a similar object, shedding new light on the Sabu disc's intended purpose. Until then, this curious artifact patiently awaits an answer, a silent reminder that our ancestors possessed abilities, ideas, and intentions we have yet to fully grasp. Whatever its true purpose, ceremonial object, mechanical part, or simply an artisan's masterpiece, the Sabu disc remains undeniably fascinating. It stands in the intersection between what we know and what remains unknown, a testament to human creativity and an enduring mystery that will continue to tease our curiosity from behind its museum glass for centuries to come. The Gujian sword is an artifact from ancient China that has fascinated historians and researchers since its discovery. It emerged unexpectedly during archaeological excavations in 1965 near Jingzhou, in China's Hubei province. Archaeologists uncovered the sword within a tomb dating back to the Spring and Autumn period, 771 to 476 BC, associated with the ancient state of Chu. While many objects from this era typically show heavy corrosion, this sword was found remarkably preserved, sealed in a wooden scabbard, and housed within a tomb chamber alongside bronze and jade artifacts. The sword itself measures approximately 55 centimeters in length, weighing just under a kilogram. Crafted from bronze, it has maintained extraordinary sharpness despite being buried underground for roughly 2,500 years. During initial examinations, experts discovered that the blade could easily cut through stacks of paper, demonstrating sharpness rarely preserved in bronze artifacts from similar periods. Additionally, its surface showed minimal signs of corrosion, making its preservation particularly. Researchers have carefully analyzed the sword's metal composition to understand how it resisted decay. They found it was crafted from a bronze alloy consisting mainly of copper with smaller amounts of tin and trace amounts of lead, iron, and sulfur. Metallurgical studies suggest that this specific combination of elements contributed significantly to its resistance to rust and helped maintain its sharpness. While advanced for its time, similar bronze compositions have been noted in other Chinese artifacts, suggesting skilled metallurgical knowledge among artisans during that era. Apart from its practical characteristics, the Gujian sword displays intricate decorative features. The surface is finely patterned with geometric shapes, including diamond-like motifs and symmetrical designs that were typical of the bronze objects from ancient China. Notably, near the sword's handle, 8 ancient Chinese characters were found clearly engraved. These inscriptions translated to King of Yue made this sword for personal use, strongly linking the artifact to Gujian, an influential ruler of the Yue state who reigned from around 496 to 465 BC. This direct historical connection has made the sword an especially valuable find for historians studying China's early dynastic history. King Gujian was a significant historical figure known primarily for his determination and military prowess. Historical texts describe Gujian as a ruler who endured years of hardship following defeat in battle against the rival state of Runa. After years of careful planning, Gujian eventually restored Yue's power and prominence. A finely crafted sword such as this likely symbolized royal authority, wealth, and possibly military strength. However, it's unclear whether Gujian himself personally used the sword in battle, or if it served primarily ceremonial functions, as a status, or as an object presented to demonstrate his wealth and power. In the broader context of ancient Chinese weaponry, the Gujian sword shares similarities with other high-status bronze blades discovered in tombs from the same era. Elite burials often included meticulously crafted weapons to signify the deceased's high rank. Comparisons to other contemporary swords suggest that the Gujian sword's remarkable preservation might have resulted from an exceptional burial environment. The tightly sealed wooden scabbard and favorable conditions within the tomb likely contributed significantly to its survival, limiting its exposure to moisture and air. The ancient metalworking techniques that created the sword remain partly mysterious, but archaeologists recognize the sophistication of artisans from the period. Bronze smiths in ancient China had already mastered alloy manipulation, carefully controlling furnace temperatures and the mixing of metals to produce strong, durable tools and weapons. Though modern technology could replicate the sword's composition today, researchers remained impressed by the precision and consistency achieved by ancient craftspeople, working entirely by hand. Currently, the Gujian sword resides in the Hubei Provincial Museum, displayed carefully in controlled conditions designed to protect its condition. Visitors can view it behind protective glass, providing an opportunity to appreciate this tangible piece of Chinese history. Due to its clear inscriptions and well-documented discovery, the sword offers a rare and direct link to a known historical figure, which enhances its cultural significance. Its discovery also underscores the capabilities of ancient Chinese metalworkers, highlighting their skill in producing weapons that could stand the test of time. Still, certain aspects remain unexplained. Researchers continue to debate why this particular alloy has resisted corrosion better than other artifacts found in similar tomb conditions. While its preservation seems likely due to careful burial and alloy composition, the exact details of these ancient methods are partially lost to time. Without specific written records detailing the sword's production methods, historians can only piece together information from analysis and context. Today, the Gujian sword stands as an important cultural artifact for China, reflecting both historical craftsmanship and the complexity of the ancient society that produced it. Although its durability and sharpness attract attention, its real value lies in the clear historical connections it provides. As researchers continue to study the sword, they hope to uncover additional insights into ancient Chinese metallurgy and craftsmanship techniques, possibly revealing more about the people who forged and wielded these extraordinary arts. these craftsmanship, our journey takes us across the globe, landing in the windswept highlands of Bolivia. Here lies one of South America's most puzzling archaeological